I'm Professor of English, and I'm the director of the Center for Refugee, Migrant, Displacement Studies. And thanks so much for having us and for letting us come together. The three of us do a lot of work together, and it's really a nice opportunity for the three of us to come together and talk about the kinds of work that we do and why it's important to us. And I'm going to be talking from a much broader perspective, issues of displacement across multiple kinds of borders and contexts. Then the next two presenters will focus in on some more local issues. I wanted to tell you about how I came to be doing research about displacement narrative in particular. So as an English professor, I'm a rhetorician, and so I'm very interested in the way that people tell stories about anything, but particularly about displacement. And how I became interested in that was through the story of Shenandoah National Park and families who were displaced from Shenandoah National Park, which is where I grew up. And my whole life, I heard stories about poor people who were moved out of their homes because they couldn't live or sustain themselves in their homes. And that was the narrative that I heard, that the government moved them out of their homes in order to form this public park through eminent domain law. And so you can see the pictures here are very monolithic representation of people who lived in the mountains. Well, after I started graduate school and became really interested in the ways that people use language to tell stories, I started investigating the history of the park much more deeply, and went to the archives and found lots of different kinds of documents that told different kinds of stories than the narrative I had heard about the people who lived in the park. And so the handwritten letter you see there is one of the archival documents I researched, and the stories that I heard in these letters, there were about 300 letters in the archives. The stories I heard in those letters told different kinds of stories than what the media had told or the history books had told about the history of Shenandoah. And one of the things that, one of the narratives told about Shenandoah was that it would be good for people to move out, because then they would move to this little white house like this one and have a nice plot of land for a garden. And so this was one of the PR pictures that the government published about why it would be good for people to move out of the mountains. So you can see the difference between that photograph and those earlier photographs. However, some of the families who were moved out of the park were not given or sold. They actually had to qualify for a government loan to have one of those resettlement houses. But some people did not have enough money or did not have jobs where they made a monthly income. Most people who were displaced were subsistence farmers. And so some people were sent to a number of places around the state, including the Virginia Colony for Epileptic and Feeble-Minded. And it was a residential place, and people were forced to stay there. And as it turns out, some people were forcibly sterilized. So this is all happening in the late 1920s and 1930s, when eugenics was a common practice, and particularly in the state of Virginia and California. And so some of the residents from Shenandoah National Park, their human rights were violated by being forced to stay in this place, and also because they were forcibly sterilized. So you can see that the narrative about the history of the park then becomes much more complex. And it was in these letters that are in the archive, together with some oral history interviews, so that you see Mary Frances there, who I interviewed, who was sent to the colony, who told counter narratives to what we knew about the history of the park. And in some of these letters, it's really interesting what they wrote about. They weren't protesting their displacement from the park. They were rather asking the government for assistance while they had to move. But there was one letter that was somewhat of a protest, where a man named Hiram Osborne said, I am an American citizen. How can you force me and my poor family out of my home? while I was writing, well, let me first tell you, this little graphic here is me trying to figure out how to analyze all this, how to analyze the archival documents, how to analyze the historical record, how to analyze the oral histories that people were telling me, and put that all together in one analysis, multiple kinds of documents and histories in one place. So if you would like to take a class from me about how to do that, I'd love to show you. So I can move through this, but this is me being a rhetorician. So let's fast forward then to me writing about these, and what's happening around the same time are lots of displacement events that I'm listening to on the news. Hurricane Katrina happened, the war in Sudan was happening, and I started to hear on the media stories by people about their displacement experiences as reporters were interviewing them. And one man who was displaced because of Hurricane Katrina, and you might remember during that news coverage, families were called refugees during Hurricane Katrina, and it was very racialized. And one man, Joseph Melanson, said, "Don't call me a refugee, I'm an American citizen." And that really piqued my interest, because in the letters I was just writing about, Hiram Osborne had said, "I am an American citizen." Fast forward then also to just keeping track of what was happening with the war in Sudan at the time. There were lots of images of refugee camps, and across all places, like this one in Rwanda, and the ones that were established in Kenya. And many of the narratives coming out of that moment were refugees, the Lost Boys in particular, who were asking to be labeled refugee. And so I got really interested in narratives across contexts. I was hearing some of the same stories, hearing lots of feelings about wanting to return home, wanting to have a life for their children, have education for their children. So whether they were a white family in 1930s Virginia, or refugees in a camp in Kenya, people had very similar things that they wanted for their families. And so I could see a lot of commonalities. But of course, experience, race, location, place, the context of what had forced someone out of their home had a lot to do with the story. But those similarities were enough for me to try to research. What does it mean? What does a narrative of displacement mean? And part of what piqued my interest were some of the images of the camps themselves that are often these aerial views. So you don't really see the people inside and what's going on, and they get very dehumanized because then they just become numbers. And it also led me to think about how different causes of displacement have intersecting issues, whether it's eminent domain, very routine flooding like we have here in Virginia and in North Carolina and in Sri Lanka. I mean, there's monsoon season, and so there's routine displacements throughout the monsoon season. And then we have a professor here, Lynn Ressler, who does research about the demise of the red spruce tree because of climate change. So that species is being displaced as well. So these are the kinds of intersections that have become important to me to research. So these are just images from a variety of different kinds of displacements, like natural disaster, Hurricane Betsy in '56, Hurricane Katrina, more recently, in the tent cities that were put in under the highway. And so I also, as a rhetorician, got really interested in the ways that refugees or displaced people are represented as displaceable, and that these kinds of, and architecturally, what these spaces look like. So what's the difference between a Japanese internment camp and the way that was built for that purpose versus the migrant farm camp in California a little bit earlier, versus the resettlement housing like the Shenandoah residents were forced to go to, versus the detention centers that are being built right now for the Mexico-US border migrants. And there's some pictures there of the Manus Island Detention Center in Australia. And so the kinds of conclusions I made about this was that when we have this kind of media representation, these kinds of narratives told about people and they are rendered displaceable, and we have images like this one where people are behind cages, usually black and brown bodies behind wire walls, then it is for the public consciousness a little easier for the public to imagine, okay, these people are displaceable, or this is actually, at least they're in a tent and safe and not in a war situation. So these are the kinds of rationalizations that the public and governments make then to render people displaceable and keep them in these spaces. So a lot of my work now is talking about issues of social justice and spatial justice. So I'm going to move along here to talk about the center just for a bit before I turn it over to Dr. Shadle, and talk about why the Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies was founded, which is to do some very intentional community building around this issue, how we tell stories about displacement, who gets to tell them, and who's and how those stories are amplified, and then what we do with them beyond that. But besides just archiving them and documenting stories, what do we do with them to inform policy, to make sure policies and procedures are changed to be more humane? So these are some of the workshops that we've held while we were getting ready to found the center, and some of the booklets that we make for community members who work with us. And we work with folks across the state with our consortium. And I'm showing you all this because I want you to know that there are lots of opportunities for students to become involved as well. We have a podcast called In Place. So if you're interested in telling your story, or you're interested in interviewing someone who could tell an interesting story about their displacement or resettlement experience, we'd love to have you be a part of the In Place podcast. We have internships available, but we also will just take a story idea as well. We also work with some educators with a nonprofit in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, and our interns from Virginia Tech help with some peer tutoring with high school graduates who are applying to college, and so they do a lot of English conversation, but also tutoring in their college entrance essays. There's also the Coalition for Refugee Resettlement, which Brett may talk a little bit about. This is a group of students who came together who do some peer tutoring in Roanoke with folks who live here. And then in order to amplify voices of people whose stories are often not heard, we have a literary and art magazine called Roots and Resettlement. Volume 2 just came out, and we have Volume 3, a call here for Volume 3. So if you're interested, email and I'll send you the call. We have lots of events, and we have a course this fall, our very first offering of Introduction to Displacement Studies. So if you want to learn more about this and look at these kinds of issues from an interdisciplinary approach, we'd love to have you in the class. So email us, and we'd love to see you. Thank you so much.
Sorry, which one? Yeah. Thank you. Of course. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm very happy to be here tonight and talk about some of these issues. What I want to talk about is we're exploring the technical aspects of this again. This is what happens when you have two people from the humanities start off. We just, everything electronic goes poorly for us. It'll be great when Scott is up here.
Yeah, but I'd be embarrassed if my comics didn't work. And I got it.
So I want to start off, and I think is thinking about what's been going on, obviously in the world recently and in Ukraine. We've been talking a lot more about refugees recently, and there's been a lot of interest, and we have people here in the room that we've been talking about, both with BRP and with our center, discussing what we can do to support refugees from Ukraine. But it's also has me thinking about why at this particular moment, there seems to be an increase of interest in this particular group of refugees. So what and should say I'm a historian, so I have no answers for anything that's going on now, but I want to put a little bit of historical context for this. So I want to step back a little bit and ask which refugees, in terms of which refugees are getting public attention and why. So obviously, refugees right now from Ukraine deserve our attention, deserve our support. But at the same time, in the world, there are people drowning in the Mediterranean trying to reach Europe. Many of them are being intercepted by navies and sent back to Libya, where they're suffering human rights abuses. The United Kingdom just developed a new policy to send asylum seekers to Rwanda to have their claims processed there and possibly stay in Rwanda for several years. The refugee camp you see on the bottom there is Kakuma, which Katie had mentioned before. Hundreds of thousands of people are kind of wasting away in refugee camps around the world. So what I want to ask is take a historical look. Why do people and governments see some refugees as deserving of support and help, but not others? So we'll go back and start in the 1930s with British refugee, or the British policy towards European Jews. And Louise London, who wrote a book on there, this is just a nice little quote, about the government assessed the question of helping Jews primarily in terms of British self-interest. Humanitarian aid to the Jews was assigned much lower priority than, for example, the maintenance of severe restrictions on alien immigration into the United Kingdom. So British policy was based on the idea of protecting Britain, much less so on the humanitarian needs of Jews fleeing Europe. This is soon after Kristallnacht. If those of you know your European history, multiple assaults across Germany on Jews, on Jewish businesses. And Sir Samuel Hoare, foreign minister of the UK, went to the House of Commons. And we can go into other reasons why Samuel Hoare was a horrible person, involving his attempt to surrender Ethiopian sovereignty to the Italians. That's another lecture on other research. But in this passage here to the House of Commons, in discussions of what might be done to help Jewish refugees in Europe. So he begins with the case of transmigrants, which he means by people who might pass through the UK, but not settle. Give them a temporary home with the understanding that they would go someplace else, maybe somewhere else in the British Empire where they could be useful, where they could get some training, where they could settle land, where they could help develop the empire. But there was no sense that these people would be welcomed on a permanent basis in the United Kingdom. But then he turned to a project that he had been approached about of welcoming Jewish children from primarily Germany, Austria, and then Czechoslovakia slightly later. With these Jewish and non-Aryan children, I believe that we could find homes in this country for a very large number without any harm to our own population. So again, you're seeing that these children are welcome, but because they won't cause any damage, any danger to the United Kingdom. Here's a chance of taking the younger generation of great people, mitigating to some extent the terrible sufferings of their parents and their friends. So again, you see how he's framing this of adults are dangerous, they're deserving if we can ship them through our country quickly to someplace else where they won't be a danger, where maybe we need more population, maybe we need people with certain skills. Children aren't dangerous to us. They aren't dangerous to our population. And so that's a good thing for us to do. He went on to say I could not help, and he's still speaking in the House of Commons, could not help thinking what a terrible dilemma it was to the Jewish parents in Germany to have to choose between sending their children to a foreign country into the unknown and continuing to live in the terrible conditions in which they are now reduced in Germany. And ultimately, about 10,000 Jewish children were brought to Great Britain as part of what was called the Kindertransport between 1938 and 1940. Their parents remained, unless they could get out in some other way, remained in Nazi-occupied Europe, and many of them perished during the Holocaust. So what we see in this case, children were deserving refugees. They weren't dangerous, and they could be welcomed because they wouldn't be dangerous. Their parents, despite Sir Samuel Hoare trying to empathize with what these parents were going through of sending their children off to a foreign country because they were safer that way. He tried to empathize with them, but not to the extent where he could envision Jewish parents being welcomed into the United Kingdom and helping them survive as well, along with their children. So the Kindertransport is still celebrated in the UK. There's still many books and BBC series and things about them. Many of the children lost their entire families. Many of them were assimilated into Christian British families where they were essentially adopted. Moving forward a little bit and coming closer to the American example. October and November 1956, thousands of Hungarians took to the streets to protest the Soviet allied government in Hungary. And within about a month, the Soviet army came in. You see, they talked about tanks in the streets, literally tanks in the streets, to crush the rebellion and prop up the pro-Soviet government, leading to tens of thousands, I think it's well over 100,000 refugees eventually seeking refuge in Austria. In the US media, the people who took to the streets were freedom fighters. Many of them were communists, many of them were socialists. They disagreed with the Soviet allied government. They were still far to the left of the New York Times and other newspapers, but the media portrayed this as a fight between good and evil, of pro-West versus and anti-Soviet. Eisenhower, president, needed to bolster his domestic standing as a strong president, as a strong anti-Soviet president. The Republican Party had been kind of bashed for not rolling back communism as they had promised to do in a previous election. So here was his chance to show himself to be strongly anti-Soviet, but not go to war over Hungary. There had been some talk, is this the time for the United States to take action to support Hungarian revolution? Didn't want to do that, but if he accepted refugees who were being portrayed as these freedom fighters, then maybe this was the chance to bolster himself domestically. But the way they were portrayed then, not just as freedom fighters, but Eisenhower spoke of them as older people, they're women, they're children. Many of them are suffering wounds inflicted by the guns of imperialist communism. So these were freedom fighters, but they're also older people, they're women, they're children, the categories that would appeal to people as people who deserve extra attention, who deserve our extra sympathy. The US government actually then engaged in a PR campaign. They hired a company, they worked with the Ad Council, if you know, they often put out the ads on TV still today. And this PR campaign over the next several months worked very hard to explain to the American public how these Hungarian refugees could assimilate quickly. They weren't some strange foreigners who were going to bring their strange customs to this country, but they were essentially could become Americans, which meaning essentially white Anglo-Americans, WASP, very quickly. So in a series of newspaper articles in Life magazine and Look magazine, the one saying 7 days after arriving in the United States, this weary refugee family was transformed into 4 ecstatic Minnesotans. I have personally never seen an ecstatic Minnesotan. They're very calm Minnesotans. If there's any Minnesotans on here, I know that you will not get angry because you're Minnesotans. Another article talked about how the family loves French fries and TV despite the language difficulties. And the image here is from, I believe it's from Life, from Life magazine, emphasizing how much they love America. They're amazed at Kleenex, what they could use just once and then throw away. So they're clearly adopting to American consumer culture. So again, Hungarian refugees, the United States took in tens of thousands of them, were portrayed both as on the right side of history, fighting the Soviet Union and kind of ignoring their communist and socialist sympathies, but also that they could become Americans very quickly. They could become indistinguishable from anybody else in Minnesota, anybody else in any other towns, because they came to love French fries and TV. I do this section of my talk very cautiously because, and we have the camera here, just go read this book if you'd prefer, by my colleague Amanda Demmer. And I'm just totally lifting this section from one of the chapters in her book, and she presented on this, and I hope she's not here because I'm going to embarrass myself. And much farther than the little bit that I'm going to talk about here. But as the South Vietnamese government was clearly about to fall in early 1975, the US government began working on ways to evacuate Vietnamese allies, employees, people, South Vietnamese who had worked with the US government as translators, as secretaries. Just a month before, as the US had evacuated Da Nang, there had been scenes of Americans fleeing, evacuating, and leaving behind employees, leaving behind South Vietnamese translators, and essentially leaving them at the mercy of the North Vietnamese army. So the US government wanted to demonstrate to the world that they wouldn't do this again, that they wouldn't leave their allies behind to meet their fates by themselves. It was also a way to shift the narrative from a failure in Southeast Asia, failure of war, to a humanitarian success if they could evacuate from South Vietnam some of their allies. But it also became posed as a moral issue, that these people had worked with us, they had served us, we have a moral duty to help them escape. Gerald Ford spoke of this as a profound moral obligation. The US ambassador in Saigon talked about having a very heavy moral obligation to evacuate as many deserving Vietnamese as possible. So you notice two things there, that they have a moral obligation to help these particular individuals, but also, as the ambassador said, deserving Vietnamese. So there are hundreds of thousands of more people who had been displaced because of the war and because of American involvement, but they're discussing the deserving ones who are the US allies in this during the war. So just through those examples, and there are many more from many different parts of the world and different time periods, what I want to do is help us kind of step back and think through why at certain times in certain places, governments, populations think about certain groups or certain individuals as deserving refugees. So why Jewish children could be accepted and welcomed, but leaving their parents to die in concentration camps. Why certain people in Saigon should be evacuated and have a moral duty to evacuate them, but not others. And so, again, this is not to say that we should not give support to anyone, but to think more about how can we come to an understanding that all refugees need support, regardless of who they are and how they're presented. If it's a human rights issue, it's an international law issue, that they all deserve support. And so how can we think about refugees in different ways, in a way that we can give them all sympathy and all of them support? Thank you.
See if the electrical engineer can operate the computer. All right, I think I pulled that off. Yeah, and first, a very big thank you for letting me do this and inviting us to come and talk about what's happening in this community with regard to refugee resettlement. And I want to start off just with a picture. You know, when I'm here, I represent a lot of people who make all this work. And you're going to see one of the themes that I get to, especially near the end, is that when you talk about resettlement and what it's like for the former refugees as they start in a community, it's a lot about the volunteers too and what those relationships are like. And I want to explain that when I get to it. To start with, about our group, we started about 6 years ago, summer of 2016. At this time, there were a lot of images. Brett referred to one, the images of people in Syria and children. And we simply got together and said, maybe there's a way we could do something at least for one family, and we should try. And once we started, there was just this windfall, our first meeting, where we didn't even announce it publicly, but we announced it in a few churches and things like that. 80 people showed up. We would have been happy with 20. But we started, this was in 2016, you know, there was an election. We decided we would go for 2 families, but then, you know, who got elected, and he decimated the refugee resettlement infrastructure in this country. It was horrific. And that made people step up even more, donors, volunteers. And so whereas we planned to go from 1 to 2 families, we went from 1 to 7, all in a few months. And before this recent period of Afghanistan, we had worked with 10 families, 6 of them here, 4 in Roanoke, with some partners I'll mention there. Of those 10 families, 5 were single mothers. We felt like, because we had such a great volunteer base, that we could work with people who are going to have a little more trouble. As you can imagine, a single mom coming over here faces challenges that a 2-parent family might not necessarily face because of the ability to have one taking care of kids and one working. Over the years, all the adults in those families began to work. Kids got into school. Some of them did very well. With Thaifa is pictured here. Graduated high school. He is today a Virginia Tech student. He wants to be a doctor, and I will bet you money that will work out. And I should say, by the way, I'm showing his picture. That'll be the end of me showing the face of somebody we worked with. For a variety of reasons, we don't do that. Their stories are theirs to tell, not ours. And so I show him because he's out in the community. He talks about his past. He's happy to be shown like this, but I won't do that anymore. They say him, we have 2 others in college. A lot of good things have happened. And then since things with Afghanistan hit, there was a big flurry of activity that we're still not fully out of. And 6 more families have come, and there'll be 2 more in the coming weeks. We're actively working on those 2 now. And we'll respond to Ukraine. I assume we're only in the early stages of talking about that, but we're certainly not ignoring it. I want to mention that we have several very key partners, the Secretary of Society, a very interesting group called the Sisters of Service, who are veterans from the U.S. military who helped us meet people from Afghanistan that they had worked with in the past. They've been crucial. Catholic Charities and Roanoke Refugee Partnership, both groups in Roanoke. And more groups than I could ever list. I could spend 20 minutes just listing the groups that have helped us. Which churches? Almost all of them. Community groups, Lions Club, healthcare providers. When we started working, we needed to talk to them about how best to work with them. And so we invited all the providers, each representative from each, to come talk to us. They all sent a representative, right? One meeting for the physical health, one meeting for the mental health. I could go on and on. There's many groups, and they all help in certain ways. As for what we're about, what we try to be, and what's our goal, is to empower people, right? Yes, we want them to come and us to help them, but the idea is for them to be self-supporting, to live here as close as possible to the way you and I. They're equal members of the community. They do their own thing. You know, they're our neighbors, and we work together as friends. It would be a stretch for me to say that it works exactly like this, and I'll explain that. But our goal is to be empowering, right? And that's what we really want to be. And we have a few core principles, right? We don't make decisions for anybody. They make their decisions. We always try to have an eye on independence. So, as we're trying to help them, we would like that to decrease over time, have them take on more and more of the work, right? And most times they want to do that. But we're trying to help them live as close to a normal life as possible, whatever that means to them. Their cultures, their traditions, we don't interfere with that. If they ask us to help support something, we do. But there's no effort to modify that or inhibit it or anything like that. We want them to live the lives they want to live. We do need for them. I mean, we can't pay expenses forever. We need for them to work if they can, to work towards learning English so they can function in society. There are many volunteers who help make those things happen. And so that's sort of a requirement, but we do work with them to figure out what the schedule to make that happen is. We don't have a fixed timeline, one size fits all. It's different every case. In fact, that's a very important aspect of us. Every case is different. We meet the person, the family, we work out a plan. Sometimes things happen, the plan adjusts, right? There is no one size fits all. There is no rule that everybody has to function like this. Every family is unique, has their own desires, their own backgrounds, their skill sets, and we just take them as they come. So resettlement, the tasks that are involved, right? They need help finding housing, navigating the bus system, finding a job, meeting employers, learning English. The transportation, rarely can they get a driver's license anytime soon from they're here. Like I said, the English, just general support. And I sort of view this as a task list because like so many things, you have the tasks. And of course, that's a big part of the planning and a big part of the thinking. It's not actually where the emotion of it and the energy of it and most of the discussion really goes. We spend a lot of time arranging transportation, arranging, tutoring sessions, things like that. There's a lot of work in that, but it doesn't really describe what it's like. And I want to get to that. Some of the challenges we face. The immigration process is not clear to anybody. In the case of the Afghans who recently came, it's changing all the time. It just changed recently, a few weeks ago. So how do you explain that to a new arrival? You can tell the rules one day and then they're different the next. And of course, they're very, very worried about this. The idea of being sent back is terrifying to them. So the immigration process makes things difficult. Healthcare. Any of us who grew up in this country would say our healthcare system is complicated. Imagine coming here and explaining to somebody who has zero experience with it, right? How we work, how it works, what insurance is, how you get it, all these things. Finances, learning our system, how checks work and credit cards and all that sort of stuff. Social services, there has to be some interactions. We help them. Some cultures have a different approach to the role of the parents in the education process. They don't necessarily, from some countries, think it's appropriate to go to the school and talk to the teacher, but that's how we do it here. And so we try and help get them over it. And one of the big things people may not realize about helping someone resettle here, if they've been through the process that you heard in the previous two talks, they're interacting with lots of people. They might have been in a camp with many different people who got resettled into all kinds of different countries. They may have family members, different parts of the world. They may have family members still in the camp. They may have family members who wish they were able to leave as refugees, but are still back home. They're in touch with all of them by cell phone, and they're hearing all kinds of things. So we can say, this is how it works. This is what you need to do. But they may have somebody else tell them something different. It can be as simple. We had a difficulty where some people were working here in Virginia, and they knew people in New Jersey who had been resettled and got COVID-19 checks from the state. Well, our state didn't do that. And they were like, why are you not giving us money when they're getting money? That's just a small example. There are many more larger ones that they're getting input from all over. So it is not so straightforward. Just come and say, this is how things work. And then they just get it and we move on. There's a lot of iteration. Challenges for the volunteers. Some of what Brett just described, to be honest, I mean, I can't lie to you. I'm not perfect in what he just described. And I think all of us to some level, right, have a little bit of those biases because we grew up and we're just, in my case, I'll say not that deep of a thinker to realize what I was doing. Aspects of that, like confidentiality and the cultural learning, what it's like, there was a lot, right? I think all of us in BRP would acknowledge, we started this in sort of a naive way. But some of the things that you have to do, some of the things you just heard about, we had to climb that learning curve. It would be wrong to say otherwise. Sometimes you have to hear some really difficult stories, or I wouldn't say necessarily have to, but families share. That can be hard on some people. And some of the stories that we hear are incredibly rough. What they've been through is just phenomenal. Sometimes they make a decision, you just wish they wouldn't, right? You see things from a different perspective than they do. And it has to be their decision. It has to be. It's their life. But sometimes what is obvious to you, a direction to go, they see something different, and you just have to roll with it. I'll talk about this more, but investment of yourself, what it means to be working with people who are resettling, to be working closely with people who are resettling. That's a relationship. It's not a series of tasks. And I want to talk about what that means and what it can be like for the volunteer. And this is fear of letting go, right? I said we want to empower them and then step back. We want them to live a normal life. They don't want somebody who's helping them all the time. They want to learn the bus system. They want to get a job and support themselves, right? And we want that for them. But when you set a volunteer up to go and help and be doing these things, driving them around, helping them get set up a school, there's a bond that forms. It's a relationship. And then you say, well, you got to step back. You got to let them do that now. It's time for you to not go to the school and be a part of the discussions about the kids' performance in school. You have to not do that. That's not easy, right? Some volunteers become aunts and uncles and cousins, right, to these families. And then you say you got to back off. That is hard for anybody in the best of circumstances. And then, as I said, everything I just said is sort of a task. But what is it really like? The people you're working with, they're talking to all their families back home. In most cases, they have plenty of people who are there who are persecuted the same way they were when they're in country, or may even be persecuted because their family members left and came here. They're dealing with all kinds of terrible situations. In the case of the families who came here from Syria and now Afghanistan, their families are going through extreme hardships. In some cases, it's in retaliation against the people who are here and the fact that they left. And the stories are daily. The suffering is daily. Lack of power, not getting enough food, or in some cases, violence that they've undergone. Well, they're talking to those families every day, right? Every night. And when you're in that situation, it's hard to focus on the tutoring or to go learn English, especially learning in school, because then you feel guilty that why are you not going off and making money and sending that money back? Why are you here and they're not together? They have to process all this and deal with it, and then be expected to do all the work of resettling, starting a new life here, become an educated, learning English, all those things. Another aspect, goals and purpose. This is I don't have Brett and Katie's expertise, but this is something I think about a lot. We, right, who've been here for a long time, may have the expectation that they would come here and want to be here and set a goal, maybe start a career, right? Something like that. We sort of think in that terms, even if we don't use those words to ourselves, have a purpose. But some people on one extreme may have been in refugee camps for a long time, may have been in some horrific situation for a very long time. They were not thinking about careers. They were not thinking about what cool job or how great it would be to speak English. They were talking about getting through tomorrow. And they went years trying to get through tomorrow. Then they come here and they have an apartment and they have a life and they have opportunities for school. They see their kids going to school, right? Safety and a chance at stability. That's all brand new. It's not stuff they've been thinking about for a long time. And so you ask what their goal is. I mean, you can't really have this conversation, but the goal is really just I got it, right? It's safety. I can survive till tomorrow. But you want them to think about jobs and education, things like that. That's a whole new mindset. And you ask what they want to do, they'll give you an answer. Somebody else can ask 10 minutes later, they'll get a different answer. And this is true even for people who are on the other extreme, who some people from Afghanistan 6 months or a year ago thought they were in lives and working on careers and had things going on and were with people that was going to last forever, right? The Taliban are gone, right? This is what life is like. I can do all these things. And then in a very short time, days, maybe weeks at the most, the bottom drops out and everything changes. And they're rushed out of there. They go to a military plane and then a military base for a month, and then they come here. And then you talk about goals. Do you want to get education? Do you want to pursue this degree or that degree? They're not thinking of anything like that. They were not, right, thinking about a whole big change in their lives. They don't have some plan for what it's going to be. They've been, just a few months, just trying to survive. And they have not figured this out. It's very hard to be in this position. Yet we need to ask them these questions. What do you want to do, right? Where do you want to get a job? What kind of English do you want? Simple tutoring, or do you want to go on something very intensive? Many things like that. And it's hard for them to answer. Just belonging, right? It's hard to realize what a sense, how empowering it is to all of us, to me, to feel like I belong here, that I'm in the right place. This is my home, right? Virginia Tech, I feel like I belong, right? I can't stand the thought of moving to another country. I can't even stand the thought of moving to another job, right? That's belonging. People, right? They're still in daily contact with their family. They just left, right? They have culture, they have family members, people they care about, right? It's hard to feel like you belong here. And I view it the way I just said it. It's empowering to feel like you belong. And if they don't feel like they belong, they're less empowered. It is a very hard thing to overcome. So this is why I want to tell you, there's all the tasks you talk about, right? Taking them to a tutoring session, driving them, helping them get a driver's license, helping them find that first job. Those are tasks, but they don't really tell the story of what it's like, for the people who are coming. Yes, they have to do all those things, but man, what's on their minds is so much different, right? It's all of these things, and it is just hard. I admire every one of them, because every single one of them did get up and pursue an education or pursue a job or form a plan, for what their life would be like here. But I look at what they're dealing with, and it just looks extremely hard to me. But here's the one thing I would really like to come across about what the resettlement process is like. It's a people process. It's not like the technology I work with in my day job. It's a people process. And I feel very strongly that it's a two-way process. And what I mean by that is we think about the people being resettled and what they're dealing with and what it's like to go through that. But there are volunteers working with them. And in some cases, they don't get very close. It might just be somebody helping drive them somewhere. But in a lot of cases, it's very close. They see each other multiple times per week. The person who's asking, do you want to go to school, or do you want to get a job? Do you want to work here? Do you want to get there? It's a lot of conversations, a lot of time, and bonds form. Many, many bonds form. And what is that like? It's two people in a relationship or more. And I don't know if I can articulate this as well as I want, but let me try it this way. These people have been through a lot. They're going through everything I just described, and that's all of them. They're all in some way dealing with all those issues. They've been through who knows what, a refugee camp, some UN security process. They might have been in a military base for a while, and then they come here and they meet somebody like me. And we say something like, if you just do what we suggest, if you answer our questions, right, and follow this process, you will be fine, right? Just do what we say and everything will be fine. Your problems will be taken care of. We want that to be true, right? But to them, I don't necessarily know really how they feel about it, but we're one more person in a long line who said that if you just do what I say, everything will fine. Our being there, our being BRP, our offering all kinds of good things is not the solution to very many of their problems. Sure, we help with housing, we help with employment. They're worried about their families, right? But it's a really important thing about people. And when you put people together, me talking to one of those families, it's exactly like that. It's promises that may or may not work out. But if you put a person who has the right thing in their heart, helping out these families, like I say, the words don't matter. You can't take away their problems, but a hug or a smile or a listening ear that's there several days in a row, weeks, months in a row, that's a communication, right? That cannot be done with words. And it represents stability, or it might represent love or kindness or some combination of all of those, but it has an effect, right? It's the beginning of trust. It takes a long time to build that up, but it's something that makes the process work. Now, I can't lie to you, that's in some ways makes it harder, because eventually you got to tell them, right? Don't help them so much. They got to be on their own. But it is one tiny part of addressing all the problems I just talked about, that they've been pushed around. They have people suffering at home. They're dealing with all this. When they have somebody that they know they can rely on and trust, it's not the solution to everything. It's a help. And I tell you this because if anybody was going to write a book on resettlement, it certainly won't be me. But the advice I would give to that person is, sure, talk about the people, the amazing stories that they've overcome, the incredible bravery they did to go through all this, but it's still the story about both the person who's helping them and the person who's being resettled. Both of those stories are very important, because it's that back and forth interaction. To some extent, we all are fueled by inspiration in some way. Why do we do this or that? We're inspired to do something like this or that. That comes from interactions and a sharing of emotions. I don't know if I express that well, but I think it's super important. And it's what I see every day that I work with BRP. I'll stop there.
And I can guide discussion from here if we read the question. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on Zoom and in person. And if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself or ask the question in the chat. And also, if panelists have questions for each other, you're also welcome to start the discussion. Yes.
Fascinating. So not sure who would give an answer worthy. So the question, if I understand it, is what do we or could we or should we take from their culture to improve ours? That's a fascinating question. The groups we've worked with, they're all from religions that a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us are not familiar with. And there's a lot of traditions we try and help them maintain. and we try and share together. So as an example, we had an iftar dinner a few weeks ago. I don't know that we try and incorporate, I can't say that we try and incorporate their culture into ours. We try and incorporate the teamwork. And I would go back to my last slide shown there. It's the relationships, right, we take into our lives. I think most of us who work closely with any of these families take that as a lifelong thing. They're going to be our friends or people we care about for a long time, and we're going to be in touch or paying attention to each other. In some cases, it's even much stronger than that. I think of it that way. I don't know if I could honestly say that I've changed my culture. I do think they changed the community. I think there's enough involvement here, and some of it spreads. You know, volunteers get a certain joy and they spread and they talk about it. I think other people pick up on that. I do think it changes some attitudes. So I think there's an impact. I don't know if I could call it a cultural impact. And Brad, I'd love you to comment on that because I'm kind of flailing here.
I would say one of the things, so my research is actually in Kenya, and when I'm there, I'm very used to people. If you go to their home, they're going to give you tea or food or something, and I forget about that when I'm in the United States. But I've had so much tea and so much coffee when I visit folks. I was at somebody's home just the other day, and there was plates of fruit laying out for me. It was Ramadan. I was the only one, who was going to be eating that. And I apologized. I had to go. And, she said, just something. And I said, no, I have to go. And I ended up with a bag of bananas and kiwi and a bottle of water, leaving the house of someone who's been in the country for, 5 months. So in a way, what it does is remind me of that kind of culture, which is a guest is somebody special, right? If there is a guest in your home, you provide them something. And so in a way, it reminds me of what our job at BRP, and I'm involved in BRP with tutoring, coordinating tutors, is that to the extent that they come as guests, but very soon they're part of the community. But it is that two-way kind of function, is that, you're coming here and you're my guest. I'm giving you something, right? You're bringing something to me, and I'm giving something to you. So it is very much two-way. I did have to remember not to have 2 cups of Syrian coffee at like 7 o'clock at night, because then that's just over. I will say personally, the other thing in a professional sense, I'm a historian now of refugees, and Katie and I have taught classes about displacement. What I have learned from these families about what they've gone through and what they desire, especially the desire to educate their children, that is just every family. It's like, whatever you can do, help my kids, right? Get them an education, get them English. That's informed a lot about how I study the experience of refugees in other places. That emphasis on creating a future, as Scott was saying, kind of trying to think through an adult, what their plan might be. The plans for the children are education and a future and help them. And that's helped me actually a lot understand experience of refugees in other times and other places. You know more than I do where the needs are.
For volunteering, we definitely have some needs. There are a few different groups, people who can help certain families with healthcare, arranging doctor's visits and things like that. Getting people settled on healthcare is always difficult, but there are a couple jobs like that. There's a whole list. I should have come prepared. But I would also answer this way. We're about to start thinking about whether we can take families from Ukraine. It comes down to exactly two things. Do we have a base of volunteers who want to help, right? So could we put together the teams? We put together a team for each family that comes. So do we have those team members? And do we have the donor base, right, to support it? When we've asked the community for help, we've gotten it every time, just about. But if you want to volunteer, there could be all kinds of interesting things coming up. We would certainly want to hear it. Boy, that is an excellent question. And the answer is yes. And one thing I'll tell you that it's been a situation of continuous improvement. One, right, I could tell you hilarious stories of how naive we were at the beginning, right? And we're slowly getting better, but still learning at an exponential rate. And so the training gets better and better, and we're actually in the middle now of implementing a whole new level based on things we've learned in the last few months. We're going back to each family and trying to give them more information and more support, right? So in the problems you just referred to, I mean, we definitely have some of that going on. I right, I'm not going to say I'm no different. I had to learn that. Brett has taught me a lot in that respect. So there are those discussions, and the way we operate, we have teams for each family, but then there's a team that supports those teams, right? Even if every team has a healthcare person, there's a healthcare group that supports each of those teams. Same for finances, same for transportation, all these different things. And then there's a coordination group that organizes all that. And so we're always trying to take the lessons learned and help, where there are issues. Like I said, some of these volunteers hear incredibly difficult things, and that makes them part of the resettlement experience. It's difficult, and there has to be a support network there. We are constantly trying to do better.
So when I'm working with tutors to recruit tutors, it's especially during the pandemic, we'll send out an email, we'll get responses, people are interested. I have this amazing multicolored Excel sheet about times when people can work and days and what their experience is. And so I talk with each one before I connect them with a family, and I listen carefully. I tell them a little bit about BRP, and then I ask why they want to do this, whatever background they have. For exactly what Anita's question was, worried about also white saviorism in this, why they want to do it. What is it that brings them to this? Is it, here are these poor people who really need help, and I'm the one to come and fix everything? No. I've been, especially this last year, I think, and I think, the last couple of years probably, had a lot more tutors who themselves are immigrants or former, refugees themselves, or children of immigrants or refugees, people who themselves had to learn English as a child, as a second language, or their parents did and they translated. And those have been some of the best tutors because they know that experience, right? They know that, what that means to, when the adult doesn't speak the language and the child has to translate, or what it's like to be dropped in a situation where they don't know what's going on. So those, and that's the exact, they know that they're not coming to save, they're there to do what they can. I don't do it as much with BRP because I try to be nicer, but I'm the faculty advisor for Coalition for Refugee Resettlement. And during their training, I come in and talk about white saviorism and all the things people have gone through. And I sum it up with, don't be an asshole. I don't say that at BRP meetings, but that's what I say. try and keep it, a little bit higher level. But I tell it, it's at CRR, I say, if you come in with that kind of attitude that you want to put it on your resume, you want to pat yourself on the back, it's just better if you don't do it at all, because it ends up doing potentially much more damage than good. Stop.
He's right about everything he said.
This is being recorded, right?
Yeah,
okay.
These are important discussions. I would have to be totally honest. So when us on the coordinating team, Brett runs the tutors, we actually don't ask that question. One, I'll just speak for myself here. I don't feel qualified to judge the answer. And I know that I had to hear a few things from Brett to set me straight at times. So I don't feel like it will be right. But I would also say that the learning curve in this work is just huge. And I have seen where people came in with an attitude like that, but really, we talk about the honeymoon phase, the first few weeks where you work with somebody and you helping them, I'm solving their problems. And then there's just a cold slap in the face that comes when you realize you are helping them with a very small part of their problems, of what they're dealing with, what's making them afraid or unhappy. And you may think you're a savior, but that attitude gets smacked down pretty fast, I think, and pretty hard. I don't want to belittle what you're asking about and what he's talking about. They're important and they do come up, to be honest, fairly routinely. But there's a whole lot more that comes with it too. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, I think if somebody does come in with that idea of the white saviorism, it's clear that it's misplaced and misguided, and it is. It's I mean, I help set up tutors for the kids. That's it. And God knows all the other stuff that's going on, and in the kids' lives as well, that I cannot even touch. Medical, psychological, emotional issues, and they're kids, right? They're in school, they're hitting puberty. There's God knows what all is going on.
And this is why I always think of it as two ways. Certainly, the people gone through that. I mean, they have that. That's an incredibly difficult, right? The volunteers don't have that much, but it very much is a two-way thing. The volunteers who are working closely with them absorb some of that and pick up and react to it and feel it too. And things just change and evolve, and it becomes a relationship in a lot of cases, not every case, but in a lot of them. And so problems like that, white saviorism, are there, but they become far more complicated. And I believe, in general, that the bigger problem becomes for a volunteer having to face that your help to them is limited compared to what all they're dealing with. Now, they eventually all succeed, right? We have people in college, pre-med, everybody's working, all this, they pull it off. But I don't know that anybody in BRP, after doing it for a little while, feels like they're the ones that did that, right? The families did that. We help facilitate a few things, but they're overcoming these amazing hurdles.
There's a lot of educational opportunities at Virginia Tech to learn more. Several classes that we're trying to develop as a program, but also that exist across the university about issues of forced from a humanities perspective or student perspective. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Dr. Powell was just saying there's plenty of opportunities, courses, also through the center to work through some of these issues that we were talking about the white saviorism and how to support, how to volunteer in these kind of organizations and, reach out, take some classes, talk to us, and then get involved. Y'all are also learning that Scott is the nice one in BRP. And then there's me. So it's fine. It balances out very nicely.
I think most of us, I love learning. Sometimes, you know, the learning hurts when you first experience it, but after a while, you feel so much better for it. You feel like you're doing well. So I can't say the word asshole, never went through my head when we were talking, but it went away really fast. Go ahead, Joe.
I haven't more than once.
It actually comes up a lot, and a lot of difficulties, because it's rare that anybody we work with realize or own up to that they could use some help from mental health care professionals. We have had some great successes where people getting that kind of help. And in a lot of ways, it's because people who provide that sort of help really stepped up and were willing to work hard at it. I would love to tell you some stories. I probably don't even know all the details myself. It's something that comes up a lot. A lot of the people we're dealing with have some form of PTSD, and their trauma is ongoing. They're dealing with some emotional issues. Some are willing to get help, some are not. Some just need time to figure it out, and we try and give it to them. We've gotten a lot of help from the mental health care community. Very direct advice, help, and involvement, and that's been crucial.
Just want to thank the speakers and thank you for coming and engaging in this conversation. And we also have some snacks. So if you're on your birthday, also welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for doing this.